In this video, we will take a look at two-stroke engines. We will go through disassembly, assembly, basic repair, and maintenance. When you see the pause button, you can stop the film to keep up. These are the basic tools you need for the process of disassembly. We begin with the engine already removed. We will then remove any remaining pieces of fascia. This can be done by undoing a few screws and bolts. Next, we will remove the spark plug. This is done by first removing the spark plug wire from the spark plug, then using a deep set socket to unscrew the spark plug. Whenever doing maintenance on your engine, it is always a good idea to check the spark plug tip to ensure the proper gap. You can find the required spark plug gap in your owner's manual or online. After the spark plug is removed, we will remove the distributor. This can be done by removing a few screws. We will then take off the carburetor. To do this, we will first need to take out the air filter so that we can access the screws. This can be done by popping open the pin that holds it shut. Then simply using the access ports, unscrew the carburetor from the crankcase. Once that is off, you need to inspect the gasket to see if it needs replacing. In our case, with inspection, it can be seen that there is no major tears or fraying, so it is still usable. Once the carburetor is out of the way, you can then remove the flywheel guard. This can be done using a ratchet and the right size socket. With the guard out of the way, you can then remove the flywheel. In order to be able to undo the bolt holding the flywheel on, you will need to brace the flywheel so it does not spin as you try to take it off. This can be done using a long screwdriver or a small crowbar. Once the bolt is off, the flywheel might not come off with just pulling. The next step will be then to remove the blade adapter. This can be very stubborn to take off. You will need to pry this off too. You may need to loosen it using a small hammer and gently tapping it. Then we will remove the cover of the exhaust system. This can be done by taking off the bolts holding it on. Once the cover is off, we can then remove the second half of the exhaust, again by taking off the bolts holding it on. Once the exhaust is off, you can inspect the seal between the exhaust port and the exhaust. In our case, it is all torn up and cannot be reused. We will have to remove the gasket. To do this, it is easiest to use a gasket remover spray and then to scrape off the remaining gasket using a knife. We will then take off the bottom half of the crankcase. This is done by undoing a few bolts. When taking off the bottom half of the crankcase, it is always good to check the face for scratches and dings. Also, you need to check the reed valves to ensure they are not damaged and closed properly. With the crankcase apart, we can then remove the shaft with the piston assembly attached. Once the piston is out, you can check where the bearings seat for wear and damage. It is also important to check the cylinder for gouging. We will then check the piston to ensure it is not wearing. It is also important to look at the piston rings to ensure they are in good shape so that during combustion there is a good seal. Also check the top of the piston to ensure there is no peculiar buildup. We will then spin the shaft bearings to make sure they feel smooth. If they feel rough or uneven when spinning, it is time to replace the bearing. You may also want to check the bearing on the connecting rod in the same fashion. To change the bearings, you can simply pull them off the shaft and slide a replacement on. To access the connecting rod bearing, you must first remove the locks on the bolts. This can be done by prying them down with a hammer and screwdriver. With this off, you can check the needles in the bearing to ensure they are in good shape or replace them. To remove the piston from the connecting rod, we must remove the piston pin which is held in by a lock ring. To remove the lock rings, the best method is to use needle nose pliers. With the lock rings out, you can simply use something small like a socket to knock out the piston pin. With the piston off, you can check the bearing through visual inspection on the top of the connecting rod. After you are done disassembling your engine and changing parts, you must put the engine back together. We will put the piston pin back in and the lock rings on. The rings can be put back in by tapping them gently in with a screwdriver and hammer. To put the bolt locks back in place, simply use a hammer to hit them back up. With the piston assembly back together, it can be put back into place in the crankcase. To do this, you will need to squeeze the piston rings together and slide the piston into the cylinder. Once the piston is back in, we need to line up the bearings to their seat. We can then put the crankcase bottom back on. Once this is put back on, you need to push the shaft seals back into place. This can be done carefully using a screwdriver. Then you can tighten down the bolts to hold everything in place using a crossing pattern. Next, we need to fix a new gasket. We use a liquid gasket to replace it. You want to apply a small even bead around the whole surface, making sure that you fully circle the whole port, including the circles around the bolt holes. Then press down the exhaust evenly onto the port and bolt it back down. With the first half of the exhaust securely bolted down, we can then bolt down the second half of the exhaust. We will then put the flywheel back onto the shaft. To put the flywheel back on, you will need to ensure that you line up the key on the shaft with the keyhole on the flywheel. Then simply tighten it down, bracing it from spinning. We will then put the flywheel guard on so that we can put the carburetor back on. When putting the carburetor back on, we need to put the gasket back on as well. Then simply screw back on the carburetor and put the air filter back in. Now screw the distributor back onto the engine. Then, using a deep socket, screw the spark plug back in. Then simply push the spark plug wire back onto the spark plug. The blade adapter will need to be put back on once the engine is back into the piece of equipment, since it is held in place by the pressure of the bolt that holds on the blade. And that concludes the basic inspection and maintenance of the two-stroke engine.